Tonight we'll learn what it takes to keep calm in the face of an international emergency. In 1983, tonight's guest was living an academic dream as an anatomy professor at St. George's University on the island of Grenada. He worked with American and international students pursuing their dreams of becoming doctors. In October of that year, though, he woke to the news of a government coup followed by a massive intervention by American troops. That story is told from the American perspective in a new Blue Ridge PBS documentary produced by my colleague Lisa Fenderson called 1 Week in October. But that film understandably does not consider the events through the eyes of the civilians on the ground who lived it. While working on that project and filming in Grenada, I was introduced virtually to Dr. Robert Jordan, and he joins me today to talk about his experience. Welcome, Dr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mike. My pleasure.
You and I have never met face to face, but when producer Kurt Schruth and I were in Grenada, we were able to interview your friend and colleague, Dr. Vish Rao, and I thought it would be a good idea to share that interview with viewers first to set the stage for our conversation.
My name is Dr. Rao. I was a professor of anatomy and associate dean of students in 1983 at St. George's University. I was teaching and doing administrative work when the intervention happened. The mood around the campus was that there was a little jubilation that Maurice Bishop, the leader of the country, was released from his house arrest, and he was walking to the fort to address the nation. So the general public and the school employees and some students were aware of that because Maurice Bishop was in house arrest a few days prior to that, and everybody was worried about him. But we had an examination. Anatomy midterm was on that day. So half of the class was on this side in the lab, half of the class was taking written exam, and I was proctoring the lab part, and Dr. Jordan was proctoring the written part. So the students came and said, and we saw the smoke coming out of the fort, some loud noise and smoke. So we said, what's happening there? Oh, Maurice Bishop has been released. Maybe they're celebrating. But it turned out that's the day when he was shot. There was a heavy influence of Eastern Bloc countries in Russia and Cuba here. They're building the airport, there was a lot of exchange. So US government was worried about the safety of US citizens. It just so happened the students were US citizens. And President Reagan, may his soul rest in peace, he made the decision to meet with the leaders of the Caribbean nations like Eugenia Charles and others, and he created the Caribbean peacekeeping forces, which augmented the restoration of democracy in Grenada. When the curfew happened, everybody stayed in their homes off campus, many of them, but at least 200 plus stayed here. So we were waiting to hear from anybody what's happening. We heard the rumor that there's US Embassy, people who had come here, and there's some kind of negotiation going on. But that was a rumor. So we didn't pay any credence to that. So I came to the campus with Dr. Jordan on my car with a white flag when the curfew was lifted, and asked the business manager to give me a truck, a school bus, a wooden bus. I said, I'll drive it if the driver doesn't want to go. No employee wanted to drive at that time. So I said, teach me how to do it, and I drove the bus from here to Grenada's food fair. And I had about 30 students in my house and about 20 more around the vicinity. So I brought them in the bus to the campus on the 25th. Helicopters came around, swooping around Cinnamon Hills and Spice Island Inn, the cottages, and they landed right here behind you in the water. That's where we went up to hip deep and got into the helicopters. I think, in my personal view, that day changed the history of Grenada for 40 years up to now, and in the future, the democracy has been restored, and we are a free nation, we have free press, freedom of speech, thought and deed. So we are happy here, and we are grateful. No other country in the world, Americans went to do something, they were appreciated. Grenada is the only country which still celebrates a national holiday of prayer. It's called Thanksgiving Day on October 25th to pay tribute to those who lost their lives, restoring democracy. It's a testimony to the role of the United States in restoring democracy in the region here.
You just heard Dr. Rao talk about, and it was great to be there at the site where the students were evacuated. But prior to that time, just kind of describe what your day-to-day life was like in Grenada before the American intervention there.
Well, when you're teaching offshore in an offshore medical school, you have a lot of different things to take into account that you don't find in a U.S. school or a metropolitan university. One, the living conditions are a bit sparse to start with, and the activities are concentrated, very concentrated, because you're there for a purpose, and that purpose is to learn as much as you can in the time you have in school, and then get off the island and get into the States and get into your training in the medical aspects of your training in the States. So there, it was a matter of basically having the same type of laboratory and lecture facilities that you find in a stateside school, but widely separated. At that time, we had 2 campuses in Grenada, located about 3 miles apart. So a typical day for me as an anatomist would be to get up in the morning, walk down the runway of Point Salines, where I lived, to the campus at True Blue, and there lecture in the morning to our maybe 200 or so medical students. And then finish up at lunch, walk back to my house at Point Salines above the airport, have lunch there, and then walk another 2 miles to my campus over in Grand Anse on the beach, where we had our laboratory, and then begin our laboratory sessions again for 200 students.
And so it was separated by two campuses, which came to be very important when the American troops decided that the students needed to be taken off the island. We were able to visit the Grand Anse campus. That is no longer part of it. There's no teaching or learning going on in that place anymore.
No, that's our campus in Grand Anse, in True Blue, has been expanded to the point where we have every facility there at the time. This time. In those days, we just had a lecture hall and 5 dormitories and a small library set up on that campus.
Now, no, I've only been to Grenada in the modern era, so I've only seen it as it is now, where there's pretty nice grocery store, and there's lots of the roads aren't bad, and the facilities are all there. How much of that was a result of the American intervention in Grenada? And you'll hear me saying, the viewers that will hear me saying intervention, because that's the term that Grenadians prefer instead of invasion, correct?
Well, it depends on your political belief. I believe it's intervention. Some people say it's a rescue mission. It's not that desperate. And others say it was an invasion, and that's the radical left, I guess, at the time. And now, as a matter of fact, nowadays. But it was an intervention. And without that, things would have been quite different, I think, had Maurice Bishop not been killed, and been allowed to remain as a prime minister in a quasi-socialist / communist government. I'm not sure if the school would still be there. I'm not sure we'd have the same things that you saw there. The stores, the automobiles, too many automobiles now, unfortunately. And all the amenities that you find almost anywhere in the world. So that's a big difference.
Your role, I mean, you were a professor, right?
Yes.
You were teaching anatomy and doing that. But on that day, and again, I just encourage our viewers to watch the documentary to learn more about the particulars of the day. But describe how you learned of the intervention and how you were pressed into service.
Well, let's go back one thing and let the audience know that I'm a professor of anatomy, born and raised in Miami, Florida. But I was in the Air Force for 4 years right out of high school and stationed in Orlando, Florida, in the McCoy Air Force Base. So I'm also got a military background. I've always been a military buff. I mean, and I can remember at 5 years of age listening to the radio about the Korean War going on, what's happening there. So I've got that background, and I've always had an interest in military. So being a professor of anatomy and then having these sorts of things happen to you made me much more aware and interested and involved in the going on, especially the so-called political going ons and some of the military going on at the time.
So, but on that day, you get the word that you are going to be responsible for helping the students get to a place where they can be safely evacuated, right?
There was there was no one day as such.
Right.
If there was a day, it was the day of the October 19th, when Maurice Bishop, who was then the prime minister, was released from house arrest and made his way down to the fort in downtown St. George's, Fort Rupert, named after his father, for him, renamed after his father. And there he, of course, and you'll see in the documentary, was eventually killed, lined up against a wall and machine gunned with 7 more members of his party, his cabinet, and his friends. That was when it actually started with us in terms of realizing we have a new involvement, a new environment, and we'll have to do something to make our best to make it live. That day, the 19th, as Dr. Rao mentioned to you, we were given an examination in Grand Anse. And I was on a break at the time, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when, like we heard gunshots, thinking it was firecrackers, thinking Maurice had been released, and the crowd was celebrating. And then I turned to a business manager who was having lunch with me at the time on the beach, and said, well, either he's released and we're in good shape, or we're in deep doo-doo. And within 10 minutes, we were in deep doo-doo. A couple guys coming up the beach bleeding, saying that the Army had opened fire on them. They were trying to kill all the people. They killed Maurice, blah, 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 save us. And from that point, in fact, that night, the government then put us on a 24-hour shoot-on-sight curfew from that point, from the 19th to the day, basically the day before the intervention.
Had you, this is, I don't know the answer to this question, that's why I'm asking you. Had you met Maurice Bishop, and
Yes.
were you familiar with him?
Well, he was a friend of the school. In our 4 years together on the island, when Maurice took over in '79 in almost a bloodless coup. We had one policeman shot by mistake with a shotgun, but it was a bloodless coup. And he was a friend of the campus, and we had no problems living at that point, as Dr. Brown may have mentioned, in the community, being aware, and I was acutely aware of the military aspects at that time. I mean, we talked about the supplies coming to the point down to the port downtown from Cuba, from Russia, from China, military supplies. They would have a curfew every Thursday night at 8 o'clock, where we know the trucks would move that material from downtown to various warehouses in Grenada. And of course, I was there looking at those trucks, wondering what that stuff is, and realizing that from later on, finding out that it was nothing more than arms, plenty of arms, ammunition, and some mechanical things that are necessary in providing comfort in a wartime environment. So they were building a nice armament there at that time. But on the campuses, we had no problem. I mean, some students were a little bit nervous seeing, little boys with big guns walking around on occasion. But for me, it was not a problem.
Sure.
They stayed their distance. Our vice chancellor at the time, Jeffrey Bourne, was always in contact with Maurice. He would attend our graduation ceremonies there on the island when we had him in '81, '82. And he was a fine gentleman, tall guy, 6'2", but a really, really articulate individual, very bright man. I was very impressed with him. I liked him a lot.
Now, you talked about walking up the runway on your way to work. So one of the reasons for the intervention, as I understand it, was we talked about the students, and they're certainly important, but that expansion was very concerning to the Americans, right? What did you see as you walked to school every day?
Well, that was not a concern for the first couple of years. That airport had been planned well before the intervention. In fact, the Canadian company actually designed the airport working with the Grenadians and with the British. And they were the first people to work on the airport itself before Maurice took power. Once Maurice stepped in as the prime minister, and the U.S. government and other governments shunned Grenada because of the socialist/communist leanings, they avoided supporting the island. And Maurice then had to reach out to those who would support him. At that time, communism was spreading, socialism was spreading. We had Nicaragua, El Salvador, we had Cuba. They all marched in to provide help, and that help included providing workers for the airport. And we walked the airport. The students ran their miles on the airport. There was no major problems with the Cubans. I mean, they were, workers slash quasi-military, but we had very few problems with them, except on the beach. When they get too much rum in them, they start flirting with the girls and, being a little rowdy.
Right, as soldiers and workers will of a certain age, pretty much always. So I don't want to run out of time without talking about that day. So the 19th, you knew things were bad. Then we moved forward to actually evacuating the students. What was that like for you? I'm sure as the adult and as the professor, you were really worried about your students, right?
Well, we were worried. We didn't know what was happening. We had a, shoot on sight curfew, but we were able to move around freely at nighttime. We had no problem getting around. We still had telephone communication between all the campuses. We had set up basically two campuses where we had our True Blue campus with about 180 students staying there on campus, not moving. Our Grand Anse campus where we had 200 students in housing there and not able to move supposedly. And then in the community around us, we had another 220 students in various safe houses that we set up between us by telephone, 5 or 6 safe houses around the campuses. So the weekend before, this is the 23rd, 24th, Saturday, Sunday, the 24th is when the curfew ended. We had some representatives from the U.S. government, the embassy in Barbados, come over to the island and talk to at least some of us who were around the Grand Anse campus, and told us that they're planning to get us off the island, get us free, get off the island, but didn't say how, when, or where. So when the curfew ended on the 24th, which is a Monday, I moved from my house at Point Salinas to Dr. Rao's house, which was a safe house, to just wait for things. And because we'd heard the airport might be involved in some sort of action, but we didn't know for sure. The diplomats said probably trucks would come in, or a boat would come up, a big cruise liner come up and take us off the island. We didn't know. So on the 24th, I moved to Dr. Rao's house, a safe house with 30 students and his 2 sons, and waited out the day. That morning, the 25th, well, we didn't sleep much the 24th. There was a lot of rum drunk, and the students were all getting restless. We were getting restless. But the 25th is when I saw and heard a plane circling overhead from Dr. Rao's house. And in Grenada at that time in '83, that was unusual. You didn't hear planes circling overhead. So I looked up, and by the time at 5 o'clock in the morning, I saw it. From my military background, I knew it was C-130. And it was circling around, and I said, oh, look. And then I noticed it started firing tracers from this plane. It turned out to be a Spectre gunship firing. And then I noticed that it was pocket marks of anti-aircraft fire exploding around it. And I said, wow, look at that. This plane is just flying around, and whoever's shooting at it is missing it. It must be the Cubans. They probably sent a plane down to practice an invasion. And then when it opened up and took out an anti-aircraft gun, it was about maybe 500 yards away from us in the house. Saw that go, and then saw the Grenadians running away from the site and jumping in jeeps, taking off their clothes to get out of their uniforms. We knew that it was something real, that we had a invasion, or we had a military action going on.
Right. How did you get all the kids to the place where they needed to be in order to get on a helicopter to get out of there?
Well, the next day we watched that all day long from rooftops. You'll see that in the PowerPoint presentation I'll be giving later on.
Right, because that's right there near the takeoff place. We have, I wish we had unlimited time. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left to go. So getting the students to that helicopter, you're trained in the military, but they're not. What was that like, just the very act of getting them out the door and into those helicopters?
I don't know.
Oh, really? Okay, you weren't there for that.
Yeah.
That's right, because
when I dropped, let's finish that story. Dr. Rao said, "Well, we got 30 in, and what about the other 10? I said, "What about the other 10? He said, "Well, there's 10 more." So we quickly drove his car and the bus back up there, and there was nobody there. And he said, "Why don't you park my car?" And he just wanted to get his car out of the action. So he put his car back in his house, away from the action. We drove the bus back to the dorms. He hopped in. I went the other way because I didn't want to go. I was watching this and having a fun time. There was also a student who had a dog, a beautiful German Shepherd, that she said they wouldn't take on a truck or a bus or something. So I said, "Well, I'll watch it. I'll stay here and take care of that." And one of our demonstrators, a histology demonstrator, had a brace on her leg from polio. And she said, "No one's going to take me anywhere. Can I stay with you?" So the three of us, my dog, me, and the demonstrator, then limped to the gross anatomy laboratory, where we then got under our desks as the invasion or the rescue mission started. First thing we heard was a big explosion to our left. And that was a anti-aircraft gun being taken out of a hotel room by A7 or Spectre. And then when we were diving under our desk, 2 more explosions blew in the windows of my office. And that was the helicopters or Spectre taken out to barracks across the street. And then we, again, in part of the story, left the office because the window's been blown out, went back to the cold room in the gross lab, got in the freezer with the cadavers, and waited half hour till all the things got quiet.
Wow. Okay. So you were waiting with the cadavers. We again, about 2 minutes left now. So as you look back on this time, how do you think that impacted both the university and you personally with the rest of your career in Grenada before you retired and moved back to Florida?
Well, the end of that story is they were evacuated by helicopter. I never knew that until later. And we'll see that later on the PowerPoint. But as far as the university goes, it was tremendous because nobody first knew where Grenada was to start with. Grenada, probably 90% of the world did not know where Grenada was. And of the 10% it did, they all lived in Grenada. So it was good. They put us on the map.
Yeah.
And the university had we had some growing pains. We had to move our operation to the States to the end of the year, till December, Christmas time. And then we had to open a second campus in Barbados to take some of the students when we reopened in 84, who didn't want to be in Grenada because of the previous action. So we ran 2 campuses at the time for 84. That put us on the map.
Yep.
If you go to the 1984 issue, December, of National Geographic, you'll read all about that. You see my picture as a youngster on one of the pictures teaching anatomy to some students. And my boss, Dr. Modica, says that picture sold more seats to our university than anything else he's done in his work.
Yeah, you just can't buy that kind of publicity, as unfortunate as it all was. Well, Bob, as we close the program, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Dr. Jordan, thank Dr. Rao. Both of you have really helped me understand the significance of the American intervention during 1 week in October 1983. We are going to record a presentation by Dr. Jordan that'll also be available on our Echo channel if you want to learn more. So for What It Takes, I'm Tom Landon.